Hello and welcome to another session on the Global Summit on Economic Abuse. My name is Sam Smethers. I'm the Chief Executive of Surviving Economic Abuse, which is a UK-based charity, which is the only charity in the UK campaigning to end economic abuse and to raise awareness of it. I'm really delighted to be joined by a really excellent panel here today. But before we begin, I'm just going to go through some housekeeping for all of us and just make sure that you're really clear about how the session is going to run. You're signed in as a participant and your camera and microphone are disabled. Today's session will be recorded for future viewing. If the contents of this session raise any issues for you, we encourage you to take whatever steps you need to prioritise your own well-being. And if you'd like to reach out for support, you'll find a link in the chat to Know More Global Directory, which is the Directory of Specialist Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Services. Finally, if you have questions for our guest speakers today, please type them in the Q&A box and we'll attempt to get to them before we finish the session. And thank you for your cooperation and we hope you enjoy today's session. So, thank you for joining us for a vital conversation on intersection of credit systems and economic abuse, an area that's often overlooked yet deeply consequential for many victim survivors. For those who've experienced economic abuse, a damaging credit rating is more than just a financial setback. It can be a barrier to safety, to independence, and to rebuilding a life. From coerced debt to fraudulent accounts opened without consent, the misuse of credit is a powerful tool of control, and its impact can last for years, even after the abuse ends. Today's session brings together voices from across the credit and advocacy landscape, credit reporting agencies, financial advocates, and survivor support organisations, all working to better understand and respond to these challenges. So together we'll explore the real-life consequences of credit damage on survivors' lives, the obstacles credit agencies face in identifying and addressing abuse-related issues, the innovative initiatives and partnerships already underway to support financial recovery, and most importantly, the path forward towards policy reform, survivor-centred practices, and a credit system that protects rather than punishes. So whether you work in finance, advocacy, or policy making, this session will offer both insight and inspiration on how we can evolve credit systems to support justice, healing, and economic empowerment. So we're very grateful to have you all here. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our panelists, then start the session. We have with us Sue Owen Bailey, who is the Head of Environmental, Social and Governance at Equifax. Julia Davis, who is the Senior Policy Communications Officer at the Financial Rights Legal Centre. John Webb, who's the Senior Consumer Affairs Manager at Experian. And we also have Erica Sussman, who's the Founder and Director of the Centre for Survivor Agency and Justice. So I'm going to kick off with the questions straight away. So Julia, coming to you first. As someone who works to advise and empower consumers in Australia, what issues do you see arising for victim survivors of economic abuse because of their credit rating?
Yeah, thanks, Sam. Thanks for having me. Look, this won't come as a surprise to anyone who works in this space, or to anyone on the panel. And, I'm sure that the same effects happen globally as they do in Australia. But family violence and financial abuse has serious impacts on a person's financial independence, on their safety, on their well-being. There are a number of ways in which victim survivors may experience credit reporting impacts, and we have seen all of these in our service. We provide free legal advice and financial counseling for consumers across Australia. So we've seen loans and credit facilities opened fraudulently without the victim's knowledge or consent, using their personal details, sometimes taking their devices and using those during a relationship or even after separation. We've seen victims get coerced into taking out loans and credit facilities, either jointly or in their own name, and largely entirely for the abuser's benefit because of a spectrum of controlling and threatening conduct or even actual violence. We've seen loans taken out with full knowledge and consent of the victim survivor, but then they are thrust into hardship because they're prevented from working, or they have no control over their own income, or they experience physical or mental illness because of the abuse. We've seen difficulty of people obtaining independence, and that's often the most significant barrier to a victim survivor leaving a violent relationship. And a lack of independence often results in victims returning to an abusive relationship. We see joint finances become a tool of control, particularly if a perpetrator no longer has physical proximity to their victim and they can't inflict harm or intimidation. And even when it's in the abuser's not in their best interest because it's a joint facility and it hurts their credit score as well, we still see ongoing abuse, stopping payments, blocking payments because they know it'll cause further pain for their victim in the future. So, unfortunately, the real world impact of credit damage on a survivor's life can be quite devastating and has a really long lasting tail. We've seen victim survivors pushed into really high cost credit arrangements because they can no longer get access to mainstream credit because of their credit score. Um, and we've seen, I've had a client, single mother who wanted to take over the joint mortgage of the family home and live in it with her kids, and couldn't because her credit score wasn't good enough to take over the mortgage on her own. And unfortunately, all the way to the point of seeing victims go bankrupt because they're just desperate for a fresh start and they want to get rid of these debts. And that, of course, has even longer lasting effects on their credit score and their credit history. So, really long tail consequences and often really complex. And without advocates and lawyers to support them, it's really difficult for victim survivors to get that fresh start.
Yeah, and we certainly see all the same issues here in the UK, so it's very, very common. Um, Erica, I'm going to come to you now. So CSAJ has led the field in advocating for consumer rights for over 2 decades, including providing intensive technical assistance to lawyers and advocates on coerced debt, legal advocacy, but also credit. So what's the situation like for women in the US?
Yes, thanks for the question. So the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice is a US-based organization, and our mission is to advance economic security for survivors of gender-based violence. Really, our work is grounded in the basic truth that there is no safety without economic security. So back when I founded the Center for Survivor Agency and Justice, which was in 2007, the term coerced debt was really a problem without a name. But in our work alongside survivors and advocates and attorneys all across the United States, we came to recognize this as really being a pervasive issue. Domestic violence survivors facing huge amounts of debt created in their name, but without their knowledge or without their consent. Sometimes they knew about it during the course of a relationship. Other times it was a discovery once they initiated their own efforts to access safety. These debts came to light. Back in 2008, as we were seeing these patterns of coerced debt happening in survivors' lives, and as advocates were working with us, we had the privilege of working with Adrienne Adams, who is a researcher from the university, from Michigan State University, and who conducted a study among women in shelter and found that 99% of survivors have experienced economic abuse. In other words, more folks who are in a domestic violence situation say that the economic component is predominant, more so than the physical component even. And that abuse, of course, takes place in two different forms. One is economic control and the other being economic exploitation. And it's that economic exploitation piece that is really what coerced debt is all about. And I want to just talk about, you had asked me sort of how that's showing up. So this is drawing both from CSAJ's work with survivors and advocates, as well as now the really in-depth research that's been done by Adrienne, by Angela Litwin, and others across the US and in other countries as well. So coerced debt, as I said, refers to all non-consensual credit-related transactions that occur in a relationship where one person uses coercive control to dominate the other person. And that coerced debt can either be fraudulent or it can be coercive in nature. So when we're talking about debt through fraud, that involves using a partner's personal information to take out credit in their name without their knowledge. So for example, someone could buy items online using their partner's credit card information or use a partner's social security number and other personal information to take out a loan without them knowing about it. The other type of coerced debt is debt through coercion, and that involves using force or threat of harm to compel a partner to take on debt that they otherwise would not have incurred. So in other words, coercion involves a demand coupled with a threat of consequences for not complying with that demand. So somebody might pressure their partner to sign their name on a vehicle loan application with a threat. It could be spoken, it could be unspoken, based on a full history of coercion, that if they don't sign, they will be sorry. That threat could be physical, it could be psychological, emotional, or financial, but at its core is the understanding that there will be harmful consequences to the survivor if they do not comply. With that as context, I'll just say that coerced debt is really results in what we call an economic ripple effect for survivors of domestic violence. Julia was just referencing this in terms of the very long-term impacts. We know that these economic harms are not kind of one-time scenarios, but rather the consequences compound over the life course. And sometimes result in both economic and physical impacts that last for a decade plus. In one study, we saw that 46% of survivors report that their credit was hurt by the actions of an abusive partner. That was conducted by the National Domestic Violence Hotline here in the US. And a study of women who called that hotline found that nearly half of callers reported that their credit score had been damaged by their intimate partner. We also know that survivors with coerced debt are 6 times more likely to report credit damage than those without coerced debt. And beyond those sort of hard costs, there's a cascade, of course, of consequences given the centrality of the credit reporting industry in our country. In 2019, we conducted an economic well-being study, which showed that the top source of coerced debt are the same critical safety resources that survivors need. And these included medical bills, utility bills, credit cards, student loans, vehicle loans, rent and mortgage payments. At the same time, though, we know that the removal of coerced debt has a significantly positive impact for survivors' access to those same safety resources. In one study, we found that when coerced debts are removed, 32% of survivors' credit scores improved by over 20 points. So, you know, in terms of what we have seen over the course of the past almost 2 decades, we've been working with advocates and lawyers across the US to both support survivors in addressing coerced debt and also rebuild credit after they've been victimized. And that includes anything from pulling credit reports to advocating with creditors and credit reporting agencies to providing support to legal advocates in the field who are attempting to correct credit errors that appear as a result of coerced debt. I'll just say that while there has been a huge amount of activation in terms of the advocacy community, both legal and non-legal, despite all of the incredible advocacy that's taken place across the US, survivors still face really tremendous barriers in accessing relief from the credit impacts of coerced debt. And this is due in large part to the credit reporting laws that are currently available in the US.
Thanks for that, Erica. And again, you know, really similar issues and patterns that we see in the UK as well. So just a follow-up question for you. This CSAJ has also played a significant role in advancing legislative change at both national and state levels. So could you just share some of the key legislative initiatives that you've championed or helped to shape?
Sure. So I can answer that in a couple of different ways. So, I mentioned just before that there's a major barrier which exists within the federal legislative landscape here in the US, and that specifically is with the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FCRA. So in 2024, to address the problem of coerced debt as it relates to that federal legislation, CSAJ submitted a petition to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau requesting that the CFPB expand the definition of identity theft and identity theft report in the Fair Credit Reporting Act in order to cover debt that is coerced. In other words, to expand the definition of identity theft to really incorporate what we know about economic abuse and economic coercion, that fraudulent acts can take place, first of all, between intimate partners. And that just because somebody knows about a debt being existing, that does not mean that they necessarily consented to it. Those comments were submitted, and we are in a holding pattern on that. But I would also just uplift some of the broader landscape shifts that have occurred over the course of the past decade plus. Perhaps the largest being that now in the United States, the Federal Violence Against Women Act includes economic abuse in the definition of domestic violence. And as a result, all of the relief that's available through VAWA, as we call it, must also be available specifically to economic abuse survivors. And I think also we've just, witnessed, as a result of some of the ebbs and flows of the federal landscape here in the US, there's been a huge amount of activation at the state level where CSAJ's National Coerced Debt Working Group has built coalitions to push forward state coerced debt protections now in 8 states, and many more states activating in order to really fill that gap and provide protections for survivors. So those are some of the efforts underway.
That sounds brilliant. And presumably you must have a statutory definition of coerced debt then in place in law, at least at state level.
That's correct.
Yeah. That's very interesting. Okay, John, I'm going to bring you in now. So just reflecting on what you've heard from Julia and Erica, how do their overviews of the challenges impacting victim survivors resonate with what you see at Experian, and what do you do to support customers, and what are the challenges you face? And maybe also if you get a moment, just touch on the work you've been doing to try and influence the financial inclusion strategy and sort of bring some of that work to the fore as well.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Sam. Well, we covered a lot of ground already from Julia and Erica. The themes that I will talk about are very similar. So, we obviously have a group of victim survivors who have generally what we deal with and what we see is fraudulent accounts. So obviously accounts that are opened without knowledge or consent, let's say. And then we have, as both have mentioned, the coerced debt. So, where they have been manipulated or forced into taking credit or using existing credit. The biggest thing which I possibly, we have talked about already is the long-lasting impact to people, both in terms of how they deal with those accounts, but also the ability to get credit. And it maybe will come as no surprise that typically, if you are the victim of economic abuse, you will have severe impacts to your credit score. Now, that might be huge amounts of outstanding debt that someone is repaying, which we'll cover in a minute, or they have a host of negative information as well. So default accounts, missed payments, possibly some more serious impacts or court judgments or bankruptcy. And the big issue there really is that you will struggle to access not only credit, but access affordable credit. And I think maybe Julia highlighted it, but the issue there is you're pushed then to very high cost credit, or certainly what we don't want is any kind of illegal money lending as well. And so repairing the information on credit reports, I think kind of to solve this problem is vital, to just make sure that what we can do is give people a fresh start, financial fresh start, so that actually they can then access vital services. So a little bit about what we do at Experian. So we have a team here who will be able to go through the process, and I'm going to split it into two again. So the fraudulent accounts and the coerced debt. Now, I'm making this really simplistic, but fraudulent accounts are pretty easy to deal with. And, generally through, this horrible situation, I quite like those because they're quite easy to get disputed and get resolved and get removed from someone's credit report, which is great. That's exactly what you want. And by coming to Experian or, any credit reference agency, in theory, is that you can go to one place and we can dispute them with every single lender, which is good news for telling your story once and getting someone to go out and contact all those lenders, so that you don't have to then speak to 5, 10, 15 different companies to tell them your story. So we will do that. Fraudulent accounts, as I said, really quite easy to deal with. Coerced debt is where we have our biggest challenges. And I know that, I speak from the side of a credit reference agency and also from what I would think is an ideal outcome. And it's far more complicated when you speak to lenders about this, in how they assess where the money went, what it was used for, how, how that application process and how you were involved in that and so on. But the biggest challenge we see is around coerced debt and the removal of the information. But I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, if you come to Experian, or like I said, credit reference agency in the UK, we can dispute all of that information with you. We can then also help people go through the process of adding a password to the credit report to help provide some extra protection in the future, so that an abuser cannot continue to open credit. Quite likely that they will have all your details, and you may still be registered on the electoral roll at your previous address if you've left. So we can go through that. And we also support victims through the process of disassociating, so breaking financial links where you can with previous partners or abusers. So we kind of take them through a journey of supporting them through that, which is great. And, we have great success around the fraudulent accounts. We can obviously walk people through the security around passwords and financial links and so on. But the bit I mentioned earlier around the coerced debt and really around the challenges is, at the moment, what we typically see is we will dispute those on behalf of someone. So we'll go to the lenders and explain the situation, and we get a very varied response from the industry. And that goes from doing nothing to writing off a debt, sometimes writing off a debt and removing some negative information. And sometimes it will be complete removal of an account with debt plus negative information. That's generally typically in a default status. But the biggest issue is that there's so many different ways that lenders deal with it that it becomes a real challenge. And so part of how we deal with that, and my well, not just opinion, but the bit we're working on with the other credit reference agencies, is around suppressing the data. So as part of the financial inclusion strategy, We are working with the other credit reference agencies in the UK, so obviously Equifax and TransUnion, to make the process a little bit simpler. So where we can confirm that someone has been a victim of domestic and economic abuse, the information can be hidden from the credit report. And that effectively does a very similar job to deleting the information in theory, because it means that it doesn't show to lenders when you apply for credit, which means the negative information plus debt is gone, which allows people, as I said at the beginning, to hopefully have access to credit. That's ongoing at the moment. Perhaps Sue might talk a little bit about some of that as well. But I think my biggest kind of, not criticism because that's too strong, but I think we have made significant moves to support people, and the big movement is around debt write-off. So it's about removal of the debt, and that's great because that means that victims don't have to spend years trying to figure out how to repay debt, or with the looming possibility of court judgments or more severe debt solutions, for example, to deal with it. So debt write-off is kind of a move in the right direction, but that's not the answer. The answer to deal with it and to give people really what I would say is the fresh start they need is removal of debt plus negative information to give them a complete fresh start on their credit report. And I hope we get there at some point, and we're making some good moves with the other credit reference agencies. So, let's hope it's not in the not too distant future.
Thanks very much for that, John. And, we've certainly been really encouraged to see the three credit ratings agencies working together in this way to try and progress this point about sort of credit restoration, because when I thought we might achieve that, everyone wasn't convinced that we'd be able to pull that off. But actually, you've kind of done it yourselves anyway. We haven't had to try very hard to persuade you. So it's been really fantastic to see that happen. Sue, can I bring you in now as one of the key partners in this at Equifax? So Equifax identified economic abuse as an issue in your financial health report in 2025, earlier this year. And you're partnering with organisations to create industry-wide solutions. Why is this important, and what does innovation look like in practice?
So I think if we go back a little bit from the financial health report in 2025, we first started looking at this in depth a few years ago, and that came from a very humble charity partnership with a women's aid charity in Nottingham, Juno Women's Aid, where we started to talk to victim survivors about their credit report through our global best credit education program, and really understand about the long-term impact. And it's quite interesting actually that that seems to be quite a theme, isn't it? It's not just about the impact today of that economic abuse, it's the long-term radiating impact on that economic well-being throughout someone's lifetime. And the story that really resonated with me was a young lady who had been a victim of economic abuse several years earlier, hadn't really understood what it was at the time, hadn't understood how to tackle it, had several conversations with creditors, wasn't really able to prove one way or another who had taken out that debt. Of course, he had all of her personal details correct. In the digital world, it's very difficult to disprove it wasn't her. And the long-term impact of that on her credit file was that she was still repaying the debt. She knew she was never going to be able to get a mortgage. She knew she was never going to be able to get a mobile phone on credit. And for me, that really resonated because, of course, a mobile phone is something, a home is, of course, very important, but a mobile phone is your freedom. It is access to the digital world. It is so much more than just a mobile phone. So on a very practical level, we really started investing in credit education with frontline services to make sure that victim survivors are able to access the right information about credit files, about credit scores, about notice of corrections, but also crucially, how to impact that with creditors. So as a credit reference agency, we are wholly reliant in the UK on the information that creditors give us. Now, fortunately, we sit at the heart of financial services alongside TU and Experian, with providing information to creditors and then obviously receiving that information back. So it's been great to be able to use the platform like the Financial Health Report to amplify the voice on this topic and really bring to the fore some of the issues that victim survivors face. So yeah, we've done quite a lot of education in that space to make sure that files are accurately reflected. But one of the things that we did was go out and talk to a lot of our clients. So one of the things that they told us was, we don't know how to report it. We do get a lot of write-offs. If we write it off a credit file, it disappears off a credit file. The long-term impact of that could be a thin credit file, in which case you are starting again from scratch. So it's a very fine balance between making sure that it accurately reflects an individual's propensity to pay, and that shows the good or bad, ugly of what their ability to be able to pay is with a true version of their credit file. And that's very, very tricky. So it's great we're able to work with Experian and TU on that. And it's great, obviously, it's on the financial inclusion stuff as well. But beyond that, we've done quite a lot of work internally to make sure that our teams have got the right skills, experience and confidence to have conversations. So that includes obviously funding some of the training with surviving economic abuse, which had a really good impact already. So we're just starting off with that. Hope to do more across the industry, but also we've really looked internally using some of these case studies and lived experience through the charities that we've been working with to understand and deeply influence what we're doing. So that has a few effects. So one of the things we've done is we've improved our vulnerability markers. So we've included specific economic abuse as one of those markers now. We've also trained our staff how to use that and identify victims. And then going forwards as well, we're also starting to look at using voice analytics. We're currently undergoing a pilot to use voice analytics to identify economic abuse in different areas of vulnerability. How can we use AI to better identify and be able to put people into the treatment path and have a good conversation? And then as John's alluded to, the creditor guidance as well. So working holistically across the industry on that creditor guidance to make sure that there's a good industry footing on how to approach this in a way that's going to be fair and accurately reflect that propensity to pay to make better credit decisions for the future.
Thanks very much for that, Sue. And can I just ask you a little follow-up question before I bring Julia and Erica back in? And that just on that point about thin credit file, because this has come up a few times since the financial inclusion strategy was published, and there's been this sort of discussion about suppressing the credit score and what the consequence of that might be, and whether that's a good or bad thing for victim survivors. So, what do you think is the solution to that? So if that's the option, it's a thin credit file or it's an erroneous credit score. What's option C, if you see what I mean? What do we do that avoids both of those?
Yeah, so for thin credit files, the other option, because of course credit files isn't the only way of checking somebody's ability to pay, and that's all a credit score is, isn't it? And that has been the case for 125 years, I think Equifax has been going for. It's about testing someone's ability to pay. There's a lot of ways that we can do that now with open banking, for example, and more inclusive ways of checking somebody's propensity to pay than just simply credit files and what you have paid in the past or what you haven't paid in the past, for example. So I think as the industry really accelerates towards better use of technology, better use of data, cleverer use of data as well, we're definitely hopeful that there'll be more inclusive ways of being able to test someone's ability to pay than just a credit score, which will hopefully alleviate the need for someone, that one size fits all approach of you wipe everything, you end up with a thin file. Actually, there'll be a different way of being able to test someone's propensity to pay.
Thanks, Sue. I think this is all really exciting. I know we always say we've got to be survivor-led in all of this to make sure that their voice is at the front and centre of whatever solutions are presented to them, so they have informed choice about what's right for them. But yeah, it does sound really, really hopeful that change is possible. So I feel really excited about that. Okay, I'm coming back to Julia and Erica now. How do these approaches compare to practice in Australia and the US? So what should we all be doing? And so Julia, I'm going to come to you first and I'll bring Erica in.
Yeah, look, we have Experian and Equifax in Australia as well, so it's really interesting to listen to you guys because I wouldn't say that our credit reporting bodies are as advanced as you guys are in the UK when it comes to really working on behalf of the victim survivor and going straight to credit providers. So I think we're in the early stages here in Australia. We only just got some law reform late 2024 that allows advocates or victim survivors to request multiple corrections in one go and to request that through an Equifax or an Experian credit reporting body. And then y'all will go talk to the credit providers directly. And the pushback has been a little bit, what? That's not our role. And we're trying to educate and say, no, it is your role. So I love hearing that you guys are already doing that in the UK because that is going to help me. But here in Australia, the laws, I would say, are quite good. They're national. Credit reporting laws are all national. There's no difference at the state level. And already the Privacy Act says that credit reporting information needs to be accurate, not out of date, correct, relevant, and not misleading. And so for years, we've argued that any sort of debts or negative information on credit reports that's a result of family violence or economic abuse are misleading as to a victim survivor's credit worthiness, right? They're not relevant to the victim's credit worthiness. You know, they're not accurate as to the victim's credit worthiness. And so they should be removed just on the basic definition of what information in credit reports should be. But excitedly, we finally got something a bit more specific in the law just last year that now says individuals basically have a right to have information corrected on their credit report if it is the result of unavoidable consequences of circumstances beyond the individual's control, such as domestic abuse. So that's great. It's really clear and straightforward for advocates, for financial advisors that, yeah, if this information is a result of financial abuse, either straight up through fraud or through coerced debt, it should be removed. The victim survivor has a right to have it removed from the credit report. So we would argue and have argued pretty successfully that all negative information, you know, if an account was opened up in a victim survivor's name and they had no knowledge of it, then all evidence of that account should get removed. The account information, any missed payment information, any default information should just get removed. If the account was opened up, you know, with full knowledge, but then ended up with a lot of missed payments because of the abuse, leave the account information because I agree you don't want to end up with a thin file unnecessarily, but that missed payment information should get cleaned right up, backdated so that, you know, ideally either it looks like they've been paying on time or it gets suppressed. Like John said, that's an option here. But yeah, you end up, it's a bit tricky because it's probably the only reason information gets suppressed is because of family violence. And so it's kind of like this big red flag to any credit provider looking at the file to be like, oh, well, this person's been a victim of family violence, which, you know, not all victim survivors want that advertised every time they go to get credit. So again, I think what's key and what we're still working towards here in Australia is making sure that credit providers have the flexibility to correct the report in the best way that's for that victim survivor. You know, so is it suppressing information? Is it removing the account information altogether? Is it backdating a hardship arrangement, which means after 12 months, the hardship indicators fall off and it looks like you've been paying on time the whole time? So we are still pushing to give credit providers a lot of flexibility because often they're the ones who intimately have been working with the victim survivor and they know what's going to be the best outcome for that person's financial health. We're also working towards making sure that credit providers have a positive obligation to inform victim survivors about the options to clean up their credit report. You know, if they know that somebody's been a victim of financial abuse, because I mean, what kind of consumers know what their rights are? Most consumers have never even got a copy of their credit report. I think in Australia every year it's about 2.5% of people get a copy of their credit report. So you talk to victim survivors a lot who don't know. They don't know how this is hurting them. They don't know how it's going to hurt them in the future. They don't know what their options are to fix it. And so there really needs to be more responsibility on the credit providing industry to have that positive obligation to talk to them about, these might be good options for you. And finally, probably the most controversial thing we're pushing for, but we keep pushing for it, is the ability, a mechanism in the framework to split joint accounts if the victim, survivor, and the credit provider think that that's the best option. It's not always the best option because, unfortunately, as anyone in this space knows, it is very common for victim survivors to leave an abusive relationship and go back, and leave and go back. And so splitting an account and then you go back, it's a big mess, right? Especially if it's a mortgage, if it's the home loan, if you can't afford it on your own. So splitting an account, you can't undo that very easily or at all, is my understanding. And you wouldn't do it lightly, but if an abusive relationship is well and truly over and someone is trying to have a fresh start and move on with their lives, account splitting is a really powerful tool that we don't have right now that could prevent a joint account holder from ongoing abuse, which we do see that all the time. Refusing to pay or calling the bank and changing details or changing payment details purely to hurt the credit score of the joint account holder. So the ability to split accounts would be really powerful, and it's something that credit providers in Australia say they can't do, but I don't believe them. I think they can, and I think what we need is actually some national pressure and some law reform, and I think it could be done in specific circumstances. So yeah, look, it's really fascinating to hear, and I'm interested to hear what's happening in the US as well.
Thanks for that, Julia. And the whole issue of joint mortgages is something he's done a lot of work on, actually. So let's have a whole other session on that another time, because we definitely need to pick that conversation up. Erica, I'm going to come to you now. Give us your perspective from the US on this.
Yes. So I have to say that I don't have a lot of great news to share with you in terms of the ways that credit agencies are responding to the needs of domestic violence survivors. And what I'd like to do is, I guess I am energized to hear about the incredible practices that are taking place in the UK, and definitely gives me a lot of hope and inspiration. To give you a sense of what's happening in the US, I guess, earlier I had referenced that CSAJ had submitted a petition to get some changes under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And in an effort to support that effort, we conducted a national study that essentially explored what the barriers are that survivors face who have experienced coerced debt. These barriers really being related to the credit-related barriers coming from experiences with coerced debt. And I want to share a little bit with you about what those barriers look like. So this study was conducted in March of 2025. Over 200 service providers across the US were surveyed about barriers both at various stages in people's credit-related journeys. And there were significant barriers. I'll just share, barriers in terms of before disputing coerced debt. Respondents shared that almost 80% said that they had difficulty just in actually obtaining a credit report. Right? So victims of coerced debt have trouble accessing online credit reports for a few reasons. They don't answer the security questions correctly because they don't know about coerced debt accounts. Their address has changed due to their circumstances when they flee an abusive situation. And so they need to send in a written request to confirm their identity. They often lack identification documents like a driver's license or a state-issued identification because they fled their home. They may be living in shelter or have a confidential address. And many immigrant victims of coerced debt don't have a social security number which makes it impossible for them to access their credit report online. So just wanted that's a threshold problem, is just 80% of folks just accessing the credit report itself is a challenge. But we also gathered a lot of information about the barriers that folks are experiencing after disputing coerced debt. So here again, under the Fair Credit Reporting Act, a credit reporting agency after a credit reporting agency receives a dispute letter from a victim, they're required to conduct a reasonable investigation. And they're supposed to, in response to that, update inaccurate information, verify that the information is accurately reported, or delete inaccurate information. For example, if it's determined not to belong to a victim of coerced debt, in the case of identity theft. And there are numerous barriers that I'll just share with you there. From the respondents in this study, 90% reported that sometimes, often, or always, credit reporting agencies remove some of the disputed coerced debt, but not all. So there was an example shared where one survivor tried to dispute debts with creditors as coerced debt, but because it was debt by coercion, they claimed that those debts had been authorized. Another client who was denied a credit report, denied in a credit reporting dispute, despite the fact that she had a police report. There was inconsistent contact information between two different folks in the relationship, and had an affidavit from the abuser based on the fact that the original credit card application basically contained the same address. So they saw the same address, and that was therefore seen as proof of consent, I suppose. Also, 83% of respondents reported that credit reporting agencies reported the coerced debt as disputed, but didn't remove the coerced debt from the credit report. So I'll just share this story of this person, this survivor, who said, "I attempted to block coerced debt on my report. I submitted police reports, divorce documents, financial reports. The credit bureaus would add a note to the debt, but would not block it. My credit score that had always been in the 800s dipped into the 500s because my ex stopped paying the mortgage on the house he got in the divorce and was supposed to refinance, but never did. I had to spend tens of thousands of dollars to fight him in court for contempt for not paying child support. His lack of paying support was my outlet to force the sale of the property and finally get out from under him. If he had paid child support, he would have let the house foreclose, and it would have been on my report for 7 years. The system is broken, and it doesn't care about abuse survivors." So these are pretty substantial examples. Others including documentation, which I think Julia referenced earlier. So many respondents saying that agencies will not accept documentation from anyone other than law enforcement, which here in the US is a tremendous problem, particularly for marginalized communities who don't see law enforcement necessarily as being helpful in many instances. So that requirement that folks have a police report is essentially denying them of access to relief. And some even reported that even having a police report was not enough, that even when somebody had a police report, they weren't able to get relief from the coerced debt. So I share all of that, just to show that it's not just a lack of understanding of how systems work, or barriers in terms of like individual survivors' fluency in systems. It's also folks even who are equipped with advocates and attorneys who are finding themselves blocked from being able to access relief under the current federal legal infrastructure in the United States. That said, I do think that there are like instances in other places of United States federal law that offer examples of how this can be done. For example, I talked about the Violence Against Women Act earlier, but we also have protections in the Joint Consolidation Loan Act that enables survivors of domestic violence and economic abuse to separate their joint student loans without their partner's cooperation and by self-certification. So, again, that economic abuse being recognized in that context. Another example that I would just highlight is in the context of tax law, where we have innocent spouse relief, and it allows individuals from underreported to get relief from underreported tax debt on a joint return when they either didn't know about the error or they were victims of domestic violence. Again, acknowledging the role that economic abuse and coercion play in people's economic choices and agency. So that is sort of my perspective on sort of where the barriers exist and where the opportunities may lie.
Thanks for that, Erica. And you've set out really powerfully both the sort of systemically enabled abuse, so that there's the abuse directly from the perpetrator, but there's all the systemically enabled abuse, which is really what we're talking about here in terms of how these systems enable perpetrators to weaponize them and perpetuate that abuse long, long after a relationship may have ended and a victim survivor has, in theory got away from the perpetrator, but actually in practice hasn't. And you also talked about the burden of proof there, which I thought was interesting because 80% of victim survivors don't go to the police, certainly in the UK. And I wanted to come back to you, Julia, on this question as well in terms of burden of proof, because you talked about a right, I think it was a right to restoration, or I can't quite remember the phrase you used, but so I wanted to ask you what the burden of proof was for victim survivors to exercise that right, because the tension is, do we go down a path of duty and rights, which actually the burden of proof is then higher, so lots of victim survivors can't access or exercise those rights because they haven't got a criminal report, they haven't been to the police. And at the moment, a lot of what we're doing with financial services firms and also with credit reference agencies is kind of based on the reporting from victim survivors, and they choose to believe them, so that the burden of proof is much lower. So it's a trade-off, really. What do you do in Australia?
So, look, I have to say we are in an incredibly debtor-friendly, victim survivor-friendly environment here. And I got my law degree in the US, so I can see the differences starkly. And here, pretty much all financial service disputes can go to the Australian Financial Complaints Authority, which is an ombudsman service. So they don't have the same evidentiary rules that you might have in a court. And really, they have a very broad fairness jurisdiction, and they can make adjudications just based on what is the fair outcome. We also have in my understanding is it's a much smaller cohort of banks. So America has maybe 5,000 banks. Australia has about five major banks. And so they kind of get together and best practice is relatively easy to develop. And so they have really good codes of practice here. They have really good sort of industry communities of practice, and advocates and domestic violence experts can kind of go to the banking industry and have pretty good access to the banking industry and can say, like, it is just simply not best practice to ask or expect a police report. And, in the last 10 years, I have really seen that change, and it would be really looked down upon for a credit provider to expect a victim survivor to have evidence of a police report or restraining order. We call it an AVO here. You still see it sometimes from second-tier lenders or from new entrants to the credit world, but it would get smushed pretty quickly by advocates who say that is simply not best practice. And actually, one of the things that we just got written into the law is that credit providers have to have to take into account the burden of proof if someone is requesting a correction, and have to basically consider whether requesting more information is going to be re-traumatizing, and they have to consider whether they already have enough information in their own system to accept that this information is inaccurate or misleading as to the person's creditworthiness. So I actually think victim survivors here are in a really strong position. We have recently in New South Wales, the state level criminalized coercive control. And one of the biggest concerns there was that it was going to backslide best practice in this space and require evidence that you've gone to the police because it's now a crime to commit coercive control. But so far, I don't think that's happened. You know, we shouted that to the rooftops when the law went through. And because financial services disputes are at the federal level, like so far that state criminal law hasn't had too much of a negative effect. But I think we have really strong best practices here to consider the burden on a victim survivor and how rare it is to go for them to go to the police and how they shouldn't have to go to the police in order to get relief from their credit provider, you know, for negative information that isn't really reflective of their creditworthiness.
Brilliant. Thanks, Julia. You've given me hope with that answer. So that's really feels encouraging. I want to find out a bit more about what you've got going on in Australia. It sounds really positive. We're coming to the end of our session. We've got a couple of minutes left. So, John, I'm going to quickly come back to you and Sue. Just to really, my question to you is, what's next? So in a year's time, if we get together, will we have sorted this, do you think, in terms of making this actually happen and getting a kind of consistent approach to credit restoration for victim survivors?
That's a big question. So, of course, yeah. Look, there's a lot of work to do, and we've talked about loads of the issues really around how the industry deals with particularly coerced debt. My hope is that not only just through us and the work we do with each other and on the financial inclusion strategy and so on moves us in the right direction, but generally this the general shift to support victim survivors will move lenders to a place where they are more supportive and understand the impacts to credit ratings and how that can impact the future. So yeah, I'm hopeful that we get to a place where actually people aren't spending many years repaying huge sums of money or sitting with negative information on their credit report. And just to leave it at this is actually a thin file is better than huge amounts of debt and negative information because you can rebuild from a thin file. And so, I think whilst we just have to work on what is the best way to do that. But I'm hopeful, and we've got wonderful people like Sue at Equifax working on this as well, which is great.
Right, I'm going to have to bring it to a close because we're out of time. And I'm finishing the session hopeful too. I think we've heard really creative thinking and solutions and practice going on around the globe. Fantastic evidence as well from Erica and Julia in terms of the victim survivor experience and the weaponizing of those financial systems and credit systems, but real, solution focused approach from credit ratings agencies on the call as well, hearing from Sue and John. Thank you very much for joining us. I want to say thank you to our speakers, Julia, Sue, John, and Erica. Fundamentally, victim survivors shouldn't be repaying coerced debts because it's not their debt, and that's the bottom line. So we've got to really get those credit ratings restored and get them access to affordable credit, and that's the future we're trying to establish for victim survivors. So thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Global Summit. Good night.